Carl Jung talked about this phenomenon he described as retrogressive restoration of the persona. It's a complicated idea, but basically what it means is that sometimes you take a leap forward and you learn some things, but you can't catalyze a new identity, so you try to go back and hide in your old identity. And that actually doesn't work, because, well, things have changed and you've learned something, and that isn't who you are anymore. And so it's like you have to cut parts of yourself off in a destructive manner to fit back into the person that you were. Now what happens here is that Pinocchio escapes from this tyrannical situation and undergoes this descent into chaos, but he tries to go back home. He tries to go back to what he was, and he can't do that anymore. His father isn't at home anymore. And so when he goes home, he finds that there's no home there. Now, this happens to people sometimes, and it's often a shock to them. So they'll often stay under the thumb of their father. And you think, well, why would someone do that? Because it means they're subject to the tyrannical judgment of their father. They're always concerned about what their father would think, or whether their father approves of them, and so forth. And you think, well, that's got to be an unpleasant place to be. Why would you do that? Freud said, for example, that no one could be a man unless his father had died. And Jung said, yes, but that death can take place symbolically. Okay, so there's that part of the idea. And then another part of the idea is, one of the times in your life when you actually realize that you're an individual is when you'll go and ask your parents something and you'll realize they actually don't know any more about what you should do than you do. And that sucks. And that's partly why people are often willing to maintain a tyrant-slave relationship with their father. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be inferior in a relationship like that. You know, you've always got the judge watching you. But on the other hand, there's always someone who knows what to do. There's always someone standing between you and the unknown that you can go ask, what should I do? Well, at some point you'll realize that the reason you can't ask that anymore is because they actually don't know any more than you do. And then that's a pain. Like that is a symbolic death. And that's also when you establish a more individual relationship with your parents. It's at that point that you could conceivably start taking care of them instead of the reverse. And that's a time that should come. But you have to let that image of perfection go. And that exposes you. Well, that's what happens here. You know, Pinocchio goes home and he wants things to be the way they were, and he wants to stay under the careful care of the benevolent father, but that's no longer possible. He's past that point, and that's why the father has disappeared. And so Geppetto has gone off to look for Pinocchio because he also needs his son, but in any case the house is abandoned. And so then we see inside the house that everything's covered with cobwebs and everything's gone, and Pinocchio and the cricket sit on the steps and they're very concerned. First of all, they wonder where he went, so they're actually concerned that he's gone, but they also don't know what to do because there's just no going home. And so, you know, that's also the case that once you hit a certain point in your development, well, it's the same thing we already talked about. The answers that you're looking for are not going to be found in your parents' house. It's as simple as that. Now, you could artificially maintain your dependency, but, you know, if you do that for too long, things get pretty ugly. Peter Pan is this magical boy. Pan is the god of everything, roughly speaking, right? And so it's not an accident that he has the name Pan. And he's the boy that won't grow up. And he's magical. Well, that's because children are magical. They can be anything. They're nothing but potential. And Peter Pan doesn't want to give that up. Why? Well, he's got some adults around him, but the main adult is Captain Hook. Well, who the hell wants to grow up to be Captain Hook? First of all, you've got a hook. Second, you're a tyrant. And third, you're chased by the dragon of chaos with a clock in its stomach, right? The crocodile. It's already got a piece of you. Well, that's what happens when you get older. Time has already got a piece of you. And eventually, it's got a taste for you. And eventually, it's going to eat you. And so Hook is so traumatized by that he can't help but be a tyrant. And then Peter Pan looks at traumatized hook and says, well, no, I'm not sacrificing my childhood for that. So that's fine, except he ends up king of the Lost Boys. In Neverland, well, Neverland doesn't exist, and who the hell wants to be king of the Lost Boys? And he also sacrifices the possibility that he'll have a real relationship with a woman, because that's Wendy, right? And she's kind of conservative, middle class, London dwelling girl. She wants to grow up and have kids and have a life. She accepts her mortality, she accepts her maturity. Peter Pan has to content himself with Tinkerbell. She doesn't even exist. She's like the fairy of porn. She doesn't exist. She's the substitute for the real thing. And so, but the dichotomy that you're talking about is very tricky, because there's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. And I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture, because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you. Because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's yeah, you're young, you know, it's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then at least you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. You know, like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber, right? You end up being a good employer. Not that plumbers, I'm not putting plumbers down. It's like more power to plumbers. They've saved more lives than doctors. So, hygiene, right? So, you know, if you're a really good plumber, well, then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand. And the Lord said unto Abram, and this is the opening of the story, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And this is one of those phrases where every clause is significant. Go somewhere you don't understand. That's the first thing. Get thee out of thy country. You know, back in the 1920s, there was a whole slew of American writers who ended up as expatriates in Paris, Hemingway among them, and a variety of others. It was very inexpensive in Paris at the time, and part of their transformation into great literary figures was the fact that they were out of their country, and now they could see what their country was, because you can't see what your country is until you leave it. So you have to go into the unknown, and that's God's first command. Go into the unknown, because you already know what you know. And that's not enough unless you think you're enough. And if you're not enough and you don't think you're enough, then you have to go where you haven't been. And so that's the first commandment to Abraham. It's like, okay, that's a good one. That makes perfect sense. Go to where you don't know. Yes. And from thy kindred. Well, what does that mean? It means grow up, right? That's what it means. It means get away from your family enough so that you can establish your independence. And that isn't because there's something wrong with your family, although perhaps there is, you know, as there is perhaps wrong with you. But it means get away. You know, I talk to people very frequently whose families have provided them with too much protection, and they know it themselves, and that means they're deprived of necessity. you know, one of the things that you see in the United States, for example, is that the children of first-generation immigrants often do better than their children. And the reason for that is that the children of first-generation immigrants have necessity driving them. And you don't know how much you need necessity to drive you, because maybe you're not very disciplined. And if a catastrophe doesn't immediately befall you if you don't act forthrightly today, then maybe you never act forthrightly, right? Because the gap between your foolishness and the punishment is lengthened by your unearned wealth, and so you never grow up and learn, and you have to get yourself away from your dependency in order to allow necessity to drive you forward. And that's to become independent and to become mature. And I think part of what's happening in our culture is that the force that's attacking the forthright movement forward of young men in particular is afraid of the power of men, because it's confused about the distinction between power and authority and competence. Like a man who has authority and competence has power as a byproduct, but the authority and competence is everything. And people who can't understand that fail to make the distinction between power and authority and competence, and they're afraid of power, and so they destroy authority and competence. And that's a terrible thing, because we need authority and competence. What else is going to allow us to prevail in the long run? And so you get away from your country, and you get away from your kin and from your father's house, right? And you go out there and you establish yourself in the world. It's a call to adventure. That's what the first lines in the Abrahamic story is, a call to adventure. Let's say there's something going on at your workplace, and you need to object to it because it's driving you crazy, and you talk it over with your wife so that you've got your head screwed on straight. You say, oh, I've got to say something. And you go there and you say something, and you know, you're stumbling and awkward and all of that. But you watch the response, and maybe you get what you're aiming at, maybe you don't. But you've learned a bunch. You've learned, well, I'm not as coherent as I could be. I'm not as good at putting my arguments together. My boss is more of a son of a bitch than he thought he was. This is a worse problem than I knew about. It's like differentiated. So now the landscape is higher resolution, and so are you. Well, so good. So maybe you're a little bit better prepared the next time you have to do that. And so the issue here, to some degree, is don't lose an opportunity to grapple with something that objects to you, especially when the objection is rather small, because that's something you say, well, I can put up with it. It's like, fair enough, like you don't want to make everything into a war. I usually use a rule of 3. If we're interacting and you do something that I find disruptive, I'll note it. It's like, potential dragon, gone. And I leave it be. And then if you do it again, I think, oh yeah, that probably wasn't merely situational, but I'll leave it be because that's still not enough evidence. But if you do it a third time, then I'll say, hey, I just noticed this. And you'll say, no, that didn't happen. And I'll say, yeah, not only did it happen, but it happened here and it happened here, and I'm not making this up. So there's something going on here, like I'm not ignoring it, and we can get to the bottom of it. And then they'll come up with a bunch of objections about why that isn't necessary, and you push those aside, and they'll come up with a few more objections, and they'll push those aside, and then usually they'll get mad or burst into tears, and if you push that aside, then you get to have a conversation. Right, and then you can solve the problem. But man, you got to be a monster, because first of all, you need 6 arguments about why their objections aren't going to stop you. And then you have to not be intimidated by the anger, and you have to not be swamped by compassion about the tears. And then you can have a conversation. And people don't do that. They won't do that. And so they don't solve the problems, and so then the problems accrue. Right? And if they accrue over 15 years of a relationship, they end up fat, ugly, and in divorce court. Let's say that you've been in a long-term relationship and it collapses. Let's say you had a tendency towards alcoholism. You weren't so great with regards to your drug use. You're not that conscientious. And you had like 4 or 5 kind of low-rent affairs. And you know it. Your marriage collapses. Bang. Well, who do you first meet when you fall into chaos? You meet King of the Monsters. and he's you. It's like, why did my marriage fall apart? What did I do wrong? Bang, 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 bang. I did all these things wrong. Why? Because that thing inhabits me. What is it? Well, that's the most horrifying question, right? Well, that's why. So down there in the archetypal space, all these things lurk. The hero and the adversary. Well, you've just met the adversary, right? Well, maybe you were a tyrant. That's certainly possible. Maybe everything around you was chaotic. So what do you encounter when things fall apart? You encounter the adversary, you encounter the tyrant, you encounter the catastrophe of nature, and you encounter the dragon of the chaos. And they're all intermingled. You have to sort that out. That's what happens to Ellis when she goes down the rabbit hole, right? She meets the Red Queen. The Red Queen is always running around. Off with their heads, off with their heads. And she says, in my kingdom, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. Right? Down the rabbit hole, you meet the archetypes. If you're in a workplace and pathological things are happening, this is easy. I can tell you how you know if pathological things are happening at your workplace or they're happening with you. One of the two, but you can straighten that out. If you're being required to do things that make you weak and ashamed, then stop. Don't do them. Like one of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn and Frankl was that systems go terribly out of control when people don't stop them when they're going mildly out of control. You know, and you might say, I should just keep my goddamn head down and shut up. It's like, maybe you should. Like, that's not bad advice. You know, you don't want to make unnecessary enemies, and you don't need any more trouble than you need. But you got to ask yourself on a day-to-day basis, what makes you think you're not selling your soul? You know, and there's so much foolishness going on in the mid-level bureaucratic world now. That's where all the tyranny seems to be focused. And the reason that it multiplies is because sensible people say nothing when they should say something. And what's so strange about that is that there are way more sensible people than people who aren't sensible. They're just not as noisy. So what you'll turn out if, like, you know, so let's say something's bugging the hell out of you at work. Well, then you have to prepare to find another job. That's the first thing you have to do. I don't think that you should find another job, but you should prepare to find another job. And if possible, you should prepare to find a better job. Because if you can't tell someone to go to hell, then you can't negotiate with them. And if they've got you over a barrel, then you can't say anything. So you got to set yourself up so you've got some mobility. And actually, that's a really good principle in your life, period. You should set yourself up so that you have a lateral move at hand. And then you should find out, well, are there things at work that are disturbing my soul? You know, and you find that out. First of all, you ask yourself, okay, I'm disturbed at work. Okay, I'm probably weak and deceitful and useless and lazy. You might as well start with that. And then you talk to some people, like your wife, your friends, your co-workers, and find out, are you stupid, deceitful, and lazy? Or is there something not so good going on at work? And maybe you should say something about it before the whole goddamn thing collapses, because that can happen. It can happen in companies a lot faster than people ever think. You know, and you may find that, well, first of all, you may find if you say something, well, first of all, that's an adventure, that's for sure. That's a bloody adventure. And you have to do it carefully. And you have to be prepared for it. But it might be the best thing that ever happened to you. And the other thing is, if you're careful about it, you get your words right. Like, and this is strategic battle, right? It's not something you wander into carelessly. Then you may find that there's lots of people who feel exactly the same way you do, and that you've actually cottoned on to something. You're a canary in a coal mine, and not just some like psychopathic mouthpiece. So you got to ask yourself when you go and do what you do, like, is this making you stronger? Is this making you weaker? And if it's making you weaker, then you got to ask yourself, do you really want to be weaker? Because the weaker you get, the more you're tyrannized. And then worse than that, like, the weaker you get, the more bitter you get. And the more you'll work towards terrible things, the more you'll snap at your wife, the more you'll kick your kids, you know. Like, it's no joke to be tyrannized at work. And so I would say you have an ethical responsibility as a citizen to forthrightly confront creeping tyranny no matter where it occurs. If you're aimed at the good, which is a question you really got to ask yourself, you know. If you're genuinely aimed at the good, then take heart, because you're a lot stronger than you think. But the other thing you got to tell people is, pick your poison. You may be in a situation where you don't have a cakewalk to the Garden of Paradise. You got tyranny or famine. Those are your choices. But you get to pick which one you have. And I would say if you're being oppressed, and I mean in your soul, by what you're required to swallow at work, well, you think you're not paying a price for that? You got no self-respect, and rightly so. But worse than that, you're an agent of your own destruction. You're destroying your own ideal, and you're letting people who are weak and corrupt win. And if you stood up and stood up properly, but you have to put yourself in order to do this, at least to some degree, right? You can't do it casually. You have to do it from some position of preparedness and strength. Then what makes you think you couldn't scare them back into the corners? And that would be a good thing. And, you know, the alternative, personally, is bad because there's a psychological degeneration that goes along with it. I've seen this with many, many of the people that I've worked with who have been tyrannized in the workplace to the absolute detriment of their psychological and physical health, right? To the point of collapse, confronting these crazy, crazy things when they were sensible people. That's a terrible price to pay, man. Like, it's a bad price. And then, if the foolishness isn't dealt with at the local level, when it's still relatively trivial, then it will multiply until it's dealt with at the social level. And we're seeing signs of that already. Antifa is a good sign of that. You know, and problems that aren't solved multiply, and soon people fight. And you know, better to argue than to fight. Unless you want to fight. And some people want to fight, and I can understand why, but I wouldn't recommend it, because that doesn't lead good places. It really doesn't lead good places. So I'd say you have a duty. Maybe that's why you stand up. It's because you have a goddamn duty to stand up and just say what you have to say. Well, it shouldn't be our life goal. Because there are times in your life when you're not going to be happy. And then what are you going to do? Your goal is demolished. And there are going to be plenty of times in your life when you're not happy. There might be years. And so it's a shallow boat in a very rough ocean. And it's based upon a misconceptualization. Happiness is something that descends upon you. Everyone knows that. You know, it comes upon you suddenly, and then you should be grateful for it, because there's plenty of suffering, and if you happen to be happy, well, wonderful. Enjoy it. Be grateful for it. And maybe try to meditate on the reasons that it manifested itself, right? Because it can come as a mystery, you know. You don't necessarily know when you're going to be happy. Something surprising happens and delights you. And you can analyze that. You can think, well, I'm doing something right. I'm in the right place right now. I've done something right. Maybe I can hang on to that. Maybe I can learn from that. What you should be pursuing instead is, well, there's two things. You should be pursuing who you could be. That'd be the first thing. It's like, because you're not who you could be, and you know it. You have guilt and shame and regret, and you berate yourself for your lack of discipline and your procrastination and all your bad habits. You know perfectly well that you're not who you could be. And God only knows who you could be. And so that's how you should be that's what you should be striving for. And associated with that, you should be attempting to formulate some conception of the highest good that you can conceive of, that you can articulate. Because why not aim for that? It's like your life is short and it's troublesome. And perhaps you need to do something worthwhile with it. And if so, then you should do the most worthwhile thing. And you should figure out what that is for you. And part of that's definitely going to be to develop your character as much as possible, to dispense with those parts of you that are unworthy. And then maybe, if you're fortunate, and you do that carefully, then happiness will descend upon you from time to time. And that's the best you've got. And then also perhaps during sorrowful times, or worse, evil times, the fact that you've strengthened your character and that you're aiming at the highest that you can conceptualize, that'll give you the moral fortitude to endure without becoming corrupted during those times, and to be someone who can be relied upon in a crisis. There's an aim. Well, the mission is the improvement of your character, the constant improvement of your character. And I think a lot of that's done in dialogue with your conscience. It's like your conscience is always telling you, Socrates said this thousands of years ago, your conscience is always telling you what you shouldn't be doing. And one of the things Socrates said was what discriminated him from the run-of-the-mill person, and why perhaps we still know of him so many thousands of years later, was that when his conscience told him not to do something, he didn't do it. He stopped saying the things that he shouldn't have been saying, and he stopped doing the things he shouldn't have been doing. And that's a start, you know. That's a discipline, I would say. That's the ability to follow a certain kind of intrinsic discipline. And maybe that's merely the cessation of evil. That's not exactly the same as the pursuit of positive good. Let's say you haven't got there yet, but that's a start. You clear away the obstacles from your vision by ceasing to engage in those activities you know to be wrong.
Are your personal goals always going to be aligned with the needs of society, with the needs of humanity?
Well, that's a trick. You know, it's optimally the answer is yes. And you can think about it like a musical score. You know how there's levels in a musical score. Each instrument is doing its own thing. Each section is doing its own thing, but it's all united into a single vision. And that's the right... This is another reason why critics of the hierarchical structure are wrong, because the proper way to set up a hierarchy is so that your interests are aligned with those of your family. That's hard. That requires a lot of negotiation. And then you and your family have your interests aligned with those of your local community, right? So that all of those levels are reinforcing each other. And then those are united at the higher level, at the higher political structure. And that's an equilibrated state, to use a phrase from the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. It's a game that everyone wants to play, and it's working for everyone at the same time. And so it isn't based on oppression or dominance from the top down. And so I think that if you formulate your character properly and you put yourself together, you start also to realize that you're not... Look, if you get married to someone, the idea is that you become one. Right? Yeah. And so it isn't just your interest anymore. Or maybe it's that your interest isn't your interest without it also being someone else's interest. Right? It's insufficiently formulated. And you need that conflict with that other person to tap you into proper shape. So what you're aiming at is you and the development of your character, but more than that. And then you do the same when you introduce children into that. You expand out that characterological capacity. And then you can continue to expand that. And so optimally, yes, what serves you should be serving at every level. People often have accused me of an individualistic bias in my moral reasoning, you know, that, well, you should get yourself together. It's like Ayn Rand. It's like, no, it's not it. You get yourself together so that you can get your family together, so you can get your community together, so that you can get the world together. All of that at the same time. There's nothing selfish about that, except the responsibility which is on you to start that, and to bear that, and to lift that, and to act it out. So it has nothing to do with chasing your short-term, impulsive, pleasure-seeking goals. You know, I think of people as beasts of burden in some sense, like we're built for a burden, and we're not happy without that burden, and we want to find the one that suits us, and that's difficult. It's part of the adventure of life to seek out the burden that suits you. But when you have that, then yes, then hopefully you're operating in harmony with the requirements of those around you. And the thing to me is that everything else pales in comparison to that. That's why it says in the New Testament that you should stack up riches in heaven. It's like there isn't anything better than that. You know, you're functioning well, your family's functioning well, you're contributing to your community. What you're doing is worthwhile, you know. You're not tormented by your conscience. You're aiming at something that the sacrifices that you have to make that clearly justify the sacrifices you have to make. Maybe even the sacrifice of your life, because you're in this, like this is a mortal game. You're in this with your whole life. And you'd think that what that would mean, at least in part, is that you need to find a game to play that's of sufficient grandeur and nobility so that perhaps even the fact that mortality is built into the structure now becomes justifiable. I mean, it's a hell of an ambition, but it doesn't seem to me to be something that's impossible. I think you can live your life enough so that it justifies itself despite its limitation. That's the real question. Can you do that? And I believe that you can, and I believe that what that means is that the human spirit fundamentally triumphs over death. And so that's optimism, you know, in the midst of the sorrow and the malevolence. We have the capacity, sorry.
Don't be sorry.
We have the capacity to transcend that. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. And there's nothing in it that isn't good. Right? It's good for you. It's good for the people you love. It's good for the broader society. It's like it's good. And that'll take you through your times of travail. There isn't anything else that will. And then maybe on your deathbed you can think, I justified the privilege, the terrible privilege of my existence. And maybe that's good enough. It's possible that that's good enough. You certainly don't have anything better to do than that, as far as I can tell. I talked to one of the people that I was working with who had a vision for retirement. I said, well, what's your vision for retirement? Well, I see myself in a beach, you know, some tropical country drinking margaritas. And I thought, first, that's not a plan. That's a travel poster. It's like, okay, let's walk through this. All right, so you go down to this tropical country and you go sit on the beach and you have a margarita. It's like, okay, well, how many margaritas? Like 10? Okay, so you're going to do that, what, you're going to do that for 6 months?
You'll be dead.
Yeah, well, you'll be this, like, pathetic, sunburned, like...
Fat.
Yeah, unhappy, hungover, cirrhotic.
In pain.
Yeah, it's like, that's your vision.
Dehydrated.
So how long can you have a margarita on a beach? Like, maybe you can do that once every 6 months for, like, 10 minutes, something like that. It's not a vision. It's like this 16-year-old fantasy of paradise. It's like, well... Yes. And it just doesn't work out. So, and the thing is that the thing that sustains people through life really is the lifting of a worthwhile burden. It's something like that. Yeah. And it's partly because we're social animals, right? It's like we're evolved to be useful to the people around us because they're much more likely to let us live if we're like that.
Yes.
So, and it's been very fun especially talking to young men about this. It's like, well, and that's the other thing too, is I think the world is full of darkness, let's say. And we could say each of us have a little bit of light. And if we release that light, if we let it shine properly, Christ, it's too cliched to go on with in some sense, but the world is a lesser place if you do not reveal from within yourself what you have to reveal. And the fact that the world is a lesser place actually turns out not to be trivial. Like if you aren't everything you could be, more people will die, more people will suffer, more evil will be unconstrained, more tyranny will reign, more chaos will remain chaotic and dangerous, all of that.
Do you mean this in the sense of like the old proverb of the wings of a butterfly fluttering become a hurricane?
It's something similar to that, but it can even be more local. It's like your family is more messed up than it could be if you were less messed up than you are.
Right.
So if you just got your act together, like 10% more, your family would be 1% better.
Right.
It's like, well, do it.
And that would ripple off into the people that they interact with.
Yes, and it ripples fast.
Yes.
That's the other thing that's so cool, is that, like, people think, well, there's 7 billion of us, and each of us is just this separate dust mote, like floating in the cosmos, and what the hell difference does it make what you do anyways? It's like, that is not how we're connected. It's like, you're the center of a network, and you know way more people than this, but let's say typically, you're going to know 1,000 people in your life, well enough to have an impact on them, okay? And each of those 1,000 people is going to know 1,000 people. So you're 1 step from 1 million, and 2 steps from 1 billion. And we are networked, technically. That's how human interactions work. And so when you do something that you shouldn't do, it's worse than you think. And when you do something that you should do, it's better than you think. And so you think, well, this is why I've been telling people, well, clean up your room. It's like, well, your room is actually networked too. It's not that easy to clean up your room, to set it. So you want your room to be set up so that when you walk in there, it tells you to be better than you generally are. It's organized. It's got direction. Everything's in its place. You try to do that in a chaotic household. You know, I've watched people do this because I had students do these sorts of things as assignments. I'd say, look, pick a small moral goal, clean up your room, and just write down what happens as a consequence. So maybe these are students in a chaotic household. The whole place is a bloody mess. No one's taking any responsibility for anything. And so they decide they're going to start to clean up their room. And then the people in the household notice. Well, the first thing they do is get pissed off. It's like, who do you think you are? Like, you think you're better than us? Like, why do you think this is worthwhile? Who died and made you God? All of that. So just by trying to organize this little part of their life, they immediately run into the people whose actions they're casting in a dim light by trying to improve themselves to some degree. They might have to have like a thorough war in their household to be allowed to do something as simple as keep the room orderly. They'll find out very rapidly that A, that's way more difficult than it sounds, and B, that the consequences of it are far more far-reaching than people think. Maybe part of it is that like everything around you is full of potential. Everything. Maybe more potential than you could ever possibly utilize. And so maybe all you have is this little rat hole of a room in some rundown place in the world. It's like, fix it up. There's more there than you think. See what happens if you fix it up. And you'll fix yourself up simultaneously because you'll have to get disciplined in order to fix up the room. And then you have a fixed up room and you'll be a more fixed up person. It's like, you think that nothing will happen as a consequence of that? Another client I worked with was having a hard time putting his kid to bed at night. And so we did the arithmetic. It's like, well, I'm fighting with my kid for 45 minutes a night trying to get him to go to bed. Okay, so let's analyze that. All right, so what does that mean? Well, it means that both of you end the day upset. That's not so good, because why would you want that? It means that you're spending 45 minutes fighting when you could spend 20 minutes doing something positive, like reading to him, say. It means that you don't get to spend that time with your wife, so she's not very happy with you, plus you're annoyed because you don't see her, plus you blame it on the kid because he's the proximal cause. It's like, that's pretty damn ugly. And then let's do the arithmetic. It's like 7 days a week, 45 minutes a day. Let's call that 5 hours, 20 hours a week, 240 hours in a year. You're spending a month and a half of work weeks fighting with your 4-year-old son. You think you're going to like him? You don't like anyone you spend a month and a half a year fighting with. It's a bad idea. Fix it. It's important. Get him to bed. Make it peaceful. You do it like these things that repeat every single day. That's a motif in this book too. Your life isn't margaritas on a beach in Jamaica. That happens now and then. Those are exceptions. Your life is how your wife greets you at the door when you come home every day. Because that's like 10 minutes a day. Your life is how you treat each other over the breakfast table. Because that's an hour and a half or an hour every single day. You get those mundane things right, those things you do every day. You concentrate on them and you make them pristine. It's like you got 80% of your life put together. These little things that are right in front of us, they're not little. That's the first thing. They are not little, and they're hard to set right. And if you set them right, it has a rippling effect, and fast too, way faster than people think. One of the things I've been suggesting to people is that they pick something difficult to do. I read this this funny little paragraph by Kierkegaard. It was written about 1840, and he was thinking about his role as a student and writer, and he was a student and writer forever. You know, he never really had a career apart from that. And he said that he wasn't one of these people who was capable of inventing something wonderful to make life easier for everyone, like so many people were doing, you know, during the Industrial Revolution. He said, well, maybe I'm one of these people whose benefit to society will be that I will make things more difficult for everyone, because there will come a time when what people want, they don't want ease, they want difficulty instead. And I think, well, that is what people want. That is what they want. You think, well, I want an easy, happy life. It's like, no, actually, that isn't what you want.
I think what people want is things that are difficult that they can overcome.
Yeah, right. That's right. They want an optimal challenge.
Well,
that's a whole different thing.
When you overcome something, when you do something difficult, whether it's, I mean, I've never written a book, but I assume when you write a book, when you're done writing that book, there's a great feeling of accomplishment, because it's very difficult to do. That feeling of for me, it's like when I put together a comedy special, or when I, you know, just anything that's difficult. There's a feeling like I did it. I did it.
Yeah, well, one of the mysteries is why that feeling exists. You know, it's not a trivial thing, that. It's to say, I did something difficult and that was worthwhile. Basically, what you're saying to yourself is, well, there was a lot of suffering attendant on that, along with the just general suffering of life, but it turned out that was worth it. That's what you want. It's like you want that sense that you're engaged in something that's worth it. I'm not a casual optimist about these sorts of things. I mean, one of the things I do in 12 Rules for Life is lay out the rationale that drives people like the Columbine High School killers. Because I understand that rationale. I've studied it for a long time. I know why they did what they did. And they have a powerful argument, but it's wrong. But there's no sense in showing how it's wrong before showing that it's a powerful argument. Like life is suffering. There is lots of malevolence. It's no wonder that people want to bring being itself to a halt. They want to take revenge on it. It's not surprising. It's the wrong way of going about it. The right way is, it's akin to the sorts of things that you were just observing, is you take on a difficult task that pushes you past where you are already. And you succeed in it, and you get this sense that, yes, that was worthwhile. It's like, that's what you want. You want to live in that place where things are worthwhile. That's paradise on earth. That's what that is. And it isn't some happy little place where, you know, someone's feeding you peeled grapes. That isn't what it is. It's more like victory on the honorable battlefield, or something like that. There's a city, and the city is full of people who are sinful. What does that mean? Well, to sin is an archery term. It means to miss the mark. So these are people who aren't oriented properly. And so the city is in a chaotic state. And God tells Jonah that he's going to go to that city and tell them just exactly what's up with them. And Jonah thinks, no, I'm not going to do that. And why? Well, that doesn't require much explanation. It's like, how popular are you going to be if you go to a city full of chaotic people and tell them why they're stupid and wrong? Jonah thinks, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't care if God's telling me to do it. So his conscience is telling him to do it, or his destiny is telling him to do it, or his orientation with higher morality is telling him to do it. You can read it any way you want. And so he thinks, no, I'm hopping on this boat and I'm getting as far away from that city as I possibly can. And so he does that, and then the storm comes up, because God thinks, no, you're not getting away. If I told you to do something, you're not getting away from it. A storm comes up. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's easy. Betray your destiny and see how long it takes you to be drowning in a storm. It'll happen immediately, and of course it will, because what's calling you to be your best is exactly the thing that's pushing you forward to manifest yourself most fully in the world. It's what you need. You run away from that, the boat's going to start to rock very, very quickly. Well, and you all know that. You know that perfectly well. It's hell, all you have to do is not study for an exam that you know that's coming up to see everything the storm waters start to rise and everything start to rock. It's pretty bloody obvious. So anyways, he's on this boat and there's a storm, and all of the people on the boat who can't quite discriminate chaos from weather, because they haven't differentiated the world to that degree, think, oh, the boat wouldn't be about to be swamped if some of us hadn't done something stupid and wrong. And there's logic in that. You know, you might think, well, God has nothing personal against you because of the storm, so you're confusing levels of analysis. But you got to give these people some credit. It's like maybe they did do something stupid. Maybe they didn't caulk the damn boat properly. Maybe the ropes aren't in as good a shape as they might be. Maybe they weren't paying attention to the weather when they went out on the ocean, you know? Or maybe they haven't made peace with their brother, and so their hearts are bent and twisted out of shape, so they don't make particularly good sailors. It's like the idea that you encounter a storm because you're stupid and wrong is a really good idea, even though it's not of infinite applicability. Anyways, they draw lots. It's a primitive thing to do. It's like, well, it's someone's fault. We don't know who. We're going to throw someone overboard, the worst sinner. Obviously, that's what God wants, some kind of sacrifice. So they all draw lots, and someone loses. And then Jonah stands up and says, well, sorry guys, like I know that I've got a problem with God at the moment, so it's probably me. You better throw me over. And they don't really want to, but he finally convinces them. Over he goes. And the storm settles. Well, you know, sometimes if you're in a group of people in an organization, there is someone in the organization whose head isn't screwed on exactly straight. And they know exactly why it is and what they've done wrong and what puts them in that position. And they are poisoning the entire enterprise. And if you throw them overboard, or better, if they agree voluntarily to leave, then the storm will abate and everything will be okay. So anyways, they throw Jonah overboard, and a whale comes up and swallows him and takes him down to the bottom of the ocean. Well, we already know what that means because we watched Pinocchio. It's like when God abandons you because you've abandoned your destiny and the storms come up, the probability that you're going to be taken down to the depths is extraordinarily high, and that happens in people's lives all the time. Well, so down there, Jonah repents. Well, what do you do when you're in the underworld? Well, you've been there before when things fall apart on you. Your friends have abandoned you. You're not as popular as you could be. You can't stand to look at yourself in the mirror. Into the underworld you go, and you think, geez, I've done a lot of things wrong. You know, maybe I should reconcile myself with the world and I could get out of this. Well, so that's what Jonah does. He thinks, all right, I've got this destiny. I better go do what God says. So the whale spits him out onto the beach, and off he goes to the city to tell them what's wrong. Well, that's what that represents. That's these symbols, you know. It's so cool. This second one I really like. It's so interesting because you see Jonah re-emerging from the whale, and he's got a halo around his head. You say, well, what's a halo? Well, have you ever looked at a quarter? Well, think about a quarter. A quarter's the moon. And who's on the quarter? The queen. The queen is surrounded by the halo of the moon. The queen's queen of the night. Gold coin, that's the king's head on the sun. That's the halo. Well, what comes out of the belly of the fish? It's the illuminated human being. It's the spirit of the illuminated human being. Well, that's what that means. Well, what does that mean? Well, what else would come out of chaos? You know, if you fall apart and then you put yourself back together, what is it that comes back out? Well, at least you're in better shape than you were before, you know, and then maybe you do that 20 times in your life, or 50 times, and you do it voluntarily. Every time you do it, you're more like the thing with the halo, and less like the thing that's, you know, being thrown overboard by your friends. And the Midianites sold Joseph into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. So now he's a slave. So now you'd think, well, this is a man who has a lot of reason to be irritated at the structure of reality, right? He's gone from being the favorite to being betrayed by all of his brothers. That's pretty rough. And then he's being transformed into a slave, and now he's being sold to work as a slave. So you'd think that would corrupt his character. Because, you know, one of the things, I think this is the case anyways, I think people are always looking for an excuse to have their character corrupted. Because if your character is corrupted, then you get to lie, and you get to cheat, and you get to steal, and you get to betray, and you get to act resentfully, and you get to do nothing. And that's all easy. It's easier to lie than to tell the truth. It's easier to do nothing than to do something. So there's always part of you thinking, well, I need a justification for being useless and horrible, because that'd be a lot less work. And so then if something terrible comes along, you think, aha, that's just exactly the excuse that I was waiting for. And then out all that comes. You know, Solzhenitsyn, when he was in the concentration camps in Russia, watching how people behaved, you know, he said that there were people that were put in the camps who immediately became trustees or guards, and they were even more vicious than the people who had been hired as guards. And his idea was that they had collected all that, he called it foulness, if I remember correctly, around them in normal life, but they didn't have the opportunity to express it. But as soon as you gave them the opportunity, it was like there it was right away. And so one of the messages that seems to echo through these Old Testament stories is that just because something terrible happens to you doesn't mean that you get to wander off the path and make things worse. And maybe it doesn't matter how terrible it is that what happens to you. And that's a tough call, you know, because you see people now and then in life who they've really got it rough, man. Like 50 bad things are happening to them at the same time, and you think, oh, it's no wonder. If you were bitter and resentful and hostile, it'd be like, yeah, no wonder. But then you meet people, and Solzhenitsyn again talked about this in the Gulag Archipelago. He said he met lots of people in the, not lots, he met enough people to impress him in the concentration camp system who didn't allow their misfortunes to corrupt them. And that's something, man. Because maybe the only real misfortune is to become corrupted. That's a really useful thing to think. You know, maybe the rest of it is trivial in comparison. I know that's a rough thing because you can be in very harsh circumstances, but I do think there's something to that. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So that's an echo of the idea that we encountered earlier about walking with God, right? So Adam walked with God before he ate the fruit with Eve, and then he wouldn't walk with God. And then Noah walked with God, and Abraham walked with God. And so the idea is, well, that's that alignment with the highest ideal. I think it's something like that. And you know, we could think about that as a metaphysical claim as well. But I don't think it is. I mean, I've got thousands of letters now in the last year from people who have told me that they were in a pit. That's exactly right. And that they decided that they were going to try to put their lives together. And that it worked. And so that's really something, you know. And they write surprised. It's like, well, I decided that I was going to work hard at what I was doing, and I wasn't going to lie any more than absolutely necessary. I thought I'd give it a try for a few months, you know. And all sorts of good things started to happen to me. It's like, maybe that's how the world works. Now, obviously, it doesn't work like that all the time, right? Because you can get sliced off at the knees. I mean, there's an arbitrary element to existence that you can't wish away. But that doesn't mean that there aren't bad strategies and good strategies. And so I do think that one of the most fundamental existential questions is, like, if things aren't going well for you in your life, is, are you absolutely certain that you're doing absolutely everything you can to put things in order? Because if you're not, then you shouldn't complain, because you don't know to what degree you're actually contributing or even causing the circumstance. Now, that's a very annoying thing to think, and I'm not trying to blame the victim. You know, I know that people end up with lung cancer because they were exposed to asbestos, you know. I'm not trying to, although I also know too that if you have lung cancer because you've been exposed to asbestos, that can be a tragedy or it can be hell, and to some degree that depends on how you conduct yourself. Well, I think the capacity for evil is something that is not easily distinguishable from strength. You know, and I mean, my knowledge runs out at this level of analysis in some sense. The world seems to be structured so that we can act for the good and we can act for evil. And I think that's associated with self-consciousness. And I think that's illustrated in the story of Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve become self-conscious, the scales fall from their eyes. They realize that they're naked. And to realize that you're naked is to understand your vulnerability. That's why Adam and Eve clothed themselves right away. Oh no, I'm naked, I can be hurt. Okay, I can be hurt. I have to clothe myself, I have to protect myself in the future. You actually become aware of that in a way that animals aren't. Well, what does it mean that you're naked? It means that everyone else is too. Yeah. What does it mean that you can be hurt? It means that everyone else can be hurt too. It means that you could hurt them. And that's why the knowledge of Good and evil goes along with the knowledge of nakedness. That took me a long time to figure out. It took me about 30 years to figure that out. So why are those two things conjoined? Oh yes. When you understand that you're vulnerable, you understand that everyone else is vulnerable, and then you have the option of exploiting that. And so that's what transforms human beings to some degree from animals, because a predator just eats you, but a human being can play with you and will, for all sorts of reasons. Now, the capacity to do that, though, why is the capacity to do that, let's say, useful? Well, it's useful to be strong and not to have to use it, because it makes you formidable. And I think that you have to be formidable in order to move forward properly in the world, even to get through obstacles that aren't. Just to get through obstacles, you have to have some strength of character. You have to have some commitment. And some of that is, there will be a cost if you interfere with me. It'll be the minimal cost necessary. Let's say if you've got yourself under control. It will be the minimal cost necessary. But do not be thinking there won't be a cost. And I don't believe that if that's not built into your character, then you have no strength, and you certainly have no strength when you're pushed by someone who's malevolent. A bully, if you're like that, if the bully pushes you, and your response is, there will be a cost for pushing me, and you will pay it, then the bully will go elsewhere. And we know that too from studies of bullies. You know, like even childhood bullies, they push around kids, and then they find the ones that retreat and withdraw, and they bully them. So, and you might think, well, usually children are bullied because of some abnormality. That's a very common idea. It's like, there's a guy named Dan Olweus, a very smart Norwegian psychologist, and he studied bullying for a long time as a precursor to fascism, by the way, so that was his interest. He said his analysis indicated that at least 3/4 of children have some obvious abnormality that could be the focus of bullying attention. It might even be your name. It doesn't take much of a genius bully to come up with a good way of making fun of your name, or you're too tall, or you're too short, or or your brother's too tall or too short, or there's something. It isn't the abnormality that is the cause of the bullying. It's the abnormality might become the focus of the bullying, but part of the cause is the withdrawal in the face of the bullies, because the bully thinks he can get away with it. Well, if you're, and it's also the case with children who are preyed upon by adult predators. Like adult predators of children look for children who are easily cowed and who won't put up a fight. So, for example, if you're teaching your children to be terrified of strangers, that's really not a very good strategy. You want kids who are confident and who will make a noise if someone messes about with them, and who are, and so that characterological strength has to be built in. This is how I think reality lays itself out. I think we all know this. You're not driven by your past like a clock. You're not deterministic. You are to some degree, because you're limited. You're a limited creature. You've got rules that you run by and all of that. You're not omniscient. But you're not driven by the past. What you do instead is confront the potential of the future. That's what's in front of you. So it's a domain with multiple pathways, and that's what's always in front of you. You could go there, you could go there, you could go there. There's an array of choices that confront you. You confront that as soon as you wake up and become conscious in the morning. And then there's all this potential that's there in front of you. And you use your ethical choice to determine which of those possibilities will become actual. And it's through that mechanism that you participate in the creation of reality. And that's the making of you in the image of God. Because that's what God did at the beginning of time, according to our old stories, right? Spoke and transformed potential into the being that was good. And that was dependent on using truthful speech. So that's what you do if you act properly, is you confront potential and you translate it into reality. And it's your soul that does that. Well, do you follow the story? That's a fundamental religious question. When people go to see a movie like Pinocchio, This is a movie I've taken apart online in some detail. It's like they suspend disbelief. No one thinks that a wooden puppet has become alive. No one questions why the wooden puppet should rescue his father from the chaos of the whale. It all just makes sense. It's like, well, yeah, but why does it make sense exactly? And isn't it interesting to notice that it makes sense? And these stories have a pattern, and the pattern has a function, and that's a religious function. You say, well, I don't know whether I believe. It's like, well, you follow the story. The Harry Potter books are a good example of that because they have a deeply, deeply religious substructure. And that's why they were so insanely popular. You know, they have to speak for a book to become that popular. Yeah. It has to speak to something that's in everyone. Because otherwise, why would they become that popular? You know, and in the second volume, Harry confronts the basilisk, the thing that turns you to stone, that lurks underneath the magic castle. It's like, well, that's life, that's Jaws. It's the same story. It's like we have a structure. It's kind of magical. We live inside it. It's a hierarchy. But underneath, there's chaos and terror. And that can come up at any time and paralyze you with its gaze, right? Turn you to stone because it's so awful. And every building is like that. And so what you have to do is you have to go down into the depths and confront that thing voluntarily. And then you find, and you'll find what's of great value in that pursuit. And be reborn. It's like, well, that's the Harry Potter story. That's the second volume. It's like, well, everyone knows that story. Do you believe it? Well, do you act it out? That's the question. Do you act it out? It's the right pattern. I think, and maybe it's not even the right pattern. Maybe the human race is a hopeless race, and there's no destination for us. But for better or worse, that's our pattern. Our pattern is the snakes are after us. Well, we can cower in our dens, or we can go out and we can find the source of the snakes, and we can contend with it. And that's what we decided to do. And God only knows how long ago, millions of years, we decided we weren't going to cower in our dens. We were going to go out and root out the snakes. It's like St. Patrick or St. George. And then we found, well, there was the snakes that will eat you. And then there were the snakes that were in other people's hearts. And then there were the snakes that were in your hearts. And all of those had to be contended with and rooted out. And that's part of the even deeper mythology. Is that like there's an association in Christianity between the snake in the Garden of Eden and Satan. It's like, well, where did that come from? What kind of crazy idea is that? Well, I just laid out the idea. It's like there's always a snake. What's the worst possible snake? Well, it isn't an actual snake. It's a metaphorical snake. It's the snake that's in the heart of your enemy when he comes to burn down your city. Well, what if you get rid of your enemies? Well, the snake's still there. Well, then it's in your heart. So what's the ultimate battle? The ultimate battle is with the snake in your heart. I had this kid talk to me at a barbecue I was at this weekend, and he's working with delinquent kids, 13 and 14 years old. And he said they were pulled out of other delinquent camps and brought to his camp, which was for the worst delinquents. And he started talking to them about my lectures. And so they've been watching him, and now they have a little fan club that's based around my lectures, and they're doing things like talking to each other about making their beds and cleaning up their rooms. It's like, it's unbelievable how little genuine encouragement many people need and how they had none. No one ever said to them and meant it. It's not okay for you to be a weak loser. It's not okay. And the reason it's not okay is because you could be way more than that. And it's a crime, an ethical crime, for you to allow all that necessary potential to go to waste. It hurts you, it hurts your family, it hurts the world. Really, really, it does.
You write in the book, there is no faith and no courage and no sacrifice in doing what is expedient. What do you say to those viewers that don't pursue their dreams and are locked in their careers because they are too afraid to take risks and pursue something meaningful?
Well, the first thing I would say is, well, you should be afraid of taking risks and pursuing something meaningful. but you should be more afraid of staying where you are if it's making you miserable. It's like the first thing you want to do is dispense with the idea that you get to have any permanent security outside of your ability to contend and adapt. It's the same issue with children. It's like you're paying a price by sitting there being miserable. You might say, well, the devil I know is better than the one I don't. It's like, don't be so sure of that. The clock is ticking.
Yeah,
and if you're miserable in your job now and you change nothing, in 5 years you'll be much more miserable and you'll be a lot older.
But isn't it a luxury to pursue what is meaningful? Our viewers have mortgages, they have children, they have payments and loans. It's a luxury to pursue because we lack the resources.
Well, I don't remember now, I'm not talking about what makes you happy. It's a luxury to pursue what makes you happy. It's a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It might require sacrifice. If you need to change your job too, let's say you have a family and children and a mortgage, you have responsibilities. You've already picked up those responsibilities. You don't just get to walk away scot-free and say, well, I don't like my job, I quit. That's no strategy. But what you might have to do is you think, well, this job is killing my soul. All right, so what do I have to do about that? Well, I have to look for another job. Well, no one wants to hire me. It's like, okay, maybe you need to educate yourself more. Maybe you need to update your curriculum vitae, your resume. Maybe you need to overcome your fear of being interviewed. Maybe you need to sharpen your social skills. Like, you have to think about these things strategically. If you're going to switch careers, you have to do it like an intelligent, responsible person. That might take you a couple of years of effort to do properly.
When you say pursue something meaningful, is it important to have a vocation?
I think it's more important to have an ethos, an ethic. So I have a program, for example, called the Future Authoring Program, which is a writing program that enables people to develop a vision for their life and then to develop a strategy. And so it's based on the idea, imagine that, and it's an extension of the ideas in the book, or at least something along the same lines. The first thing that you want to do is figure out, imagine you were taking care of yourself, like you were someone you cared for, which is rule number 2, by the way, essentially. Then you should figure out, well, if you could have what you needed and wanted, what would it be? What sort of friends would you have? What would your family relationships look like? How would you conduct yourself with your children? How would you educate yourself? You need to think through how it is that your life could be properly arranged if you had that ability. And then you can aim at that. And the funny thing is that if you do posit a goal of that sort and work towards it, you will move towards it. The goal will change because you'll learn things along the way. But I mean, I've dealt with hundreds of people in my clinical and consulting practice, and we set a goal, we develop a vision and work towards it, and things inevitably get better for people. So it's not a luxury, it's difficult. It's a moral responsibility, and it isn't happiness. It's not, the pursuit isn't for happiness. The meaning is what you have to buttress yourself against the tragedy of life. It's like engagement. We're having an engaging conversation. You know, we'll walk away from this, and hopefully the people who are watching, they'll walk away and they'll think that was worthwhile. It's like, okay, think about what that means. Mm-hmm. It means that despite the fact that you're a fragile, damaged, mortal creature, you found something to do that announced itself as worthwhile. Mm-hmm. That's meaning. It's an instinct. Like, it's a deep, deep instinct. It's maybe the deepest instinct. It's like a form of vision, except it's not like an embodied sense. It's not a specified sense. Meaning tells you when you're in the right place. And the right place is between chaos and order. And those are real places. Your hemispheres, like your right hemisphere is roughly evolved, let's say, to deal with things you don't understand. That's chaos. And your left is there to deal with things you do understand. And you can't just stay with the things you do understand because you already understand them. And you can't just stay with what you don't understand because then you're lost. Yeah. Well, you need to be in the middle of those two. And you can tell when you're in the middle because everything lines up and you feel engaged and that what you're doing is meaningful. It's like, that's what you pursue. Expedience is you do the thing that gets you off the hook the fastest right now. Well, you play that game across time, it doesn't work. It sends you down because you're sacrificing the future for the present. Meaning doesn't do that. Meaning says, I'm here where I should be. And you can't tell why, it's just that everything is right. And you get this physiological sense. Right place, right time, right conversation, you know? And that's usually a conversation where you're both trying to expand the way that you look at the world. Well, so you follow this meaningful path. That's your buttress against the tragedy that produces resentment and malevolence. His meaning is the antidote to that. And that's the fundamental religious truth. And it's really true. That's the thing that's so... Life is suffering. That's true. There's malevolence. That's true. Meaning is the antidote to that. Yes. And it's not some kind of fragile epiphenomena. It's the deepest thing. So people need to know that. It's so important to know that. People say, well, meaning isn't real. It's like, no, that's wrong. It's actually the most real thing. It might even be more real than suffering and evil. It's possible. And like, I think about this technically, you know, this isn't a metaphysical assumption that I'm making. And you do feel it. You feel it in your body. It's not just a mental thing. It's not an idea. It's a place. It's a place. Because we're in time and space, right? And a place is a place, you know, 3 dimensions of space, but it's also a time. And when the place and the time are set up properly, you're in the right place. And your brain is telling you that. Your being is telling you that. Yeah, you got it right. Right? You know, it's going to fall apart because you're not going to be there all the time.
Right. You forget that pretty quick often, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's just part of life.
Yeah, well, you say, you know, you go see a great movie. It's like, hey, you're in the right place at the right time, and you're engaged. You're completely engaged in it. It's because there's no other way to put it. You're in the right place at the right time, and the meaning is the signal of that. And so the purpose of profound religious contemplation, in some sense, in the deepest sense, profound philosophical contemplation, is to learn how to be in the right place at the right time all the time. Now, you can't, because you're not perfect, but you can be there a lot more than you are, and you can actually practice it. You practice it by paying attention. You watch yourself during the day like you don't know who you are, eh? Or what you're doing. And you notice, oh yeah, right there, I was listening to that piece of music, or I was having that conversation, or I was doing this piece of work. Then I was there for like 10 minutes. Okay, why? I was doing something right. I don't know what it is. I wasn't doing something wrong. You know, and so I got this little illuminated moment. It's like, okay, I need to figure out how to be there more often. So there's this line from the Gospel of Thomas, which was discovered in like 1957. And it says, the kingdom of God is spread out before the eyes of men, but men do not see it. That's basically it. And that's kind of what it's referring to. It's like there are times when you're in the right place at the right time, and then you're where you should be. And you don't notice that. You don't say, oh, look, wow, there's something about this is right. I got to figure out how to do this more.
Right, because that sucks you out of it immediately, even if you could do that, right?
Right, well, that's also partly why it's hard. And you're not really trained to notice that, because it isn't something we ever talk about. It's like, you're in the right place at the right time. Okay, why? What did I do right? What did I do? I need to do more of that. So maybe it's only half an hour a week when you first start noticing. And then maybe with 3 months of practice, you can get it up to like an hour a day. And then maybe you can get it up to 4 hours a day. And God only knows where you could get it if you keep practicing, you know. You can be there. We don't know what the upper limit of that is.
This is what when players talk about being in the zone, when you're
definitely.
You're just throwing it up and you're not even thinking and it's going in and you don't even realize it.
Yeah.
And often when they talk about it after, that they won't even realize that, wow, that was a 7-minute stretch. They think of it as a 30-second little thing.
That's right, time goes away. Yes, well, that's the Tao that the Taoists talk about. That's the zone. That's the line between chaos and order. And to be there is to be in the right place. That's why people watch sports. Like, part of it's the competition and the victory. And that's all fine. But the serious thing is those moments when you're in the zone with the players, because they're acting out being in the zone, and everyone loves that. In the Quidditch game in Harry Potter, there's 2 games going on at the same time. There's the ordinary game, which is just a game, and there's the Seeker game. And the Seeker is going after this golden thing that flickers in front of them. And if they get that thing, then they win, and the team wins. Well, she got it exactly right. That little thing, the snitch that everyone is chasing, is actually an ancient alchemical symbol for the union of chaos and order.
Huh.
I don't know how in the world she figured that out. It's called the round chaos. It's unbelievably obscure. If you look it up on Google, I think the only reference to the round chaos is from my website. I learned it from reading Jung. I don't know how she figured it out.
Wow.
But so the seeker is seeking this thing that glimmers in front of him, right? And moves everywhere, right? That's Mercury, the winged messenger of the gods, right? And so you're chasing that, and now and then you get it, and everyone wins. So yeah, that's meaning.